Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Mark Gabberty, and this is the podcast for entrepreneurs who are looking for the breakthrough for their businesses. Podcasts are one of the highest growing forms of content production we have available to us. And with the growth of podcasting, there's also a new growth strategy in town, getting on other people's podcasts. It's quicker and more effective than guest posting because you get the backlink, provide content quicker than you could write a guest post in typical circumstances, and build a healthy relationship. So, how do you get on more podcasts like this one and plenty of others? That's the focus of today's episode. Today's guest is the founder and CEO of Interview Connections, which offers a high-touch, concierge-level experience for podcasters and guest experts. She is the author of Interview Connections, how to #rock the podcast from both sides of the mic. She's been called the podcast queen and has shared the stage with dozens of top experts at places like Podcast Movement, Podfest, Dream Business Academy, and Podcast Mid-Atlantic. Today's guest for episode 125 of the Breakthrough Success Podcast is none other than Jessica Rhodes. Jessica, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Mark, thank you so much for having me on Breakthrough Success. I mean, I've booked a lot of my clients on your podcast, so I am very excited to be on mic with you.
Jessica, it is very great to have you on the show. And a lot of those clients, I mean, I've had so many great conversations, so I do thank you for leading them my way. But I'd love to get some background before we talk about being on more podcasts. So why did you start Interview Connections?
So I started Interview Connections after seeing a need in the marketplace for this kind of service. I went into entrepreneurship as a way to stay at home because I was pregnant with my first child. I had been working for a nonprofit organization, full-time hours, not a lot of money, and becoming a new mom, I wanted a different lifestyle. So I started being a virtual assistant. My dad is a business coach, so he became my first client. And I just started I learned a lot. I learned about business. I learned about marketing. I really just started paying my dues, working for, not a lot of money, networking, and figuring out where I could fit into this whole online business world. And so one of the services that I was offering as a virtual assistant was booking people for interviews on podcasts and helping my clients find guests to interview on their show. There was nobody else doing this. It was brand new. I mean, if people were getting interviewed on podcasts, they were just being invited by the host directly. And so when I started reaching out to hosts and pitching my clients, I made one-sheets on Microsoft Word. Like, that's how old school this was. I can't believe how much has changed. Now they're like beautiful. We got graphic designers, logos. I had a Microsoft Word. I would just drag and drop the text boxes with their bio. And they were so ugly now that I think back. But I just did what worked, and nobody really knew any different. Nobody else was doing these nice podcast one-sheets. So as I was pitching my dad, because like I said, he was my first client, and some other clients, I was getting a really warm response. And I remember I had one host that said, well, what do you do? And I'm thinking, I'm like, me? Like, I'm just a virtual assistant. I'm at home with my baby. I'm like, look at my amazing client who's built all these big businesses. But he was curious what I did. And so that would just got, my mind thinking, oh, okay, maybe there's a story to share. Maybe people really want guests on their show to share authentic stories. And you don't have to be a wildly successful entrepreneur. This is about people connecting and building relationships. So I reached a point in my business a few months in where I wanted to be making more money, and I didn't want to be working more hours. So I talked to I know it's like, how can I make more money and not work more? Well, there is a way. So I created interviewconnections.com so that I wasn't just selling my time. I didn't want to just have a job where I was my own boss. I wanted to actually have a business where I could scale. And the more clients I have doesn't mean I'm then working so many more hours. So by creating interviewconnections.com, I could sell, packages of bookings rather than saying, I'll work 12 hours a month and let's see what happens in those 12 hours, which is what I used to do.
And it's interesting how this was a basically unexplored space, and you were sort of a pioneer in booking people on other people's podcasts and contacting hosts. And you've had a lot of experience contacting hosts, getting your guests on a lot of shows, myself included. So, how are you building relationships with top podcast hosts? Because as you mentioned earlier, I've had a lot of guests from your services come on my show, but I'm sure that you have other relationships like this with other hosts as well. So how do you build those relationships?
Yeah, that is a great question because it's all about relationships, especially, with a lot of other people doing the same thing. Like when I started doing this in 2013, nobody else was pitching. So it was like, it was awesome because they were like, wow, you have somebody to pitch me. This is so exciting. And now you got to really try to get through into their email inbox. Hopefully they'll open your email. So, I mean, a couple things. Number one, my business partner and I go to conferences and we really work to build relationships with people in person. I put myself out there and apply to speak at conferences because if I'm on stage talking about business, marketing, podcasting, it's building credibility. It's getting the Interview Connections brand heard by more people. So when my employees are pitching, they are recognized. I also put a lot of effort into developing our staff on how to write a good pitch. We actually had a comedian, an improv comedian, come into our office and do a workshop on comedy writing. And I was thinking I needed to train them on copywriting, which I think is really important, a really important skill. But comedy writing has been amazing because they're learning how to be more engaging and entertaining. And Mark, getting pitches, you're getting so many pitches. Yes. The ones that make you laugh and the ones that you actually like reading, that's a good sign. Like that's what makes you reply and say yes. And I get pitched too for my show. And the ones that are super boring, I'm just like, I'm bored. Can I go watch some Netflix? Like this is not lighting me up. But the ones that are funny, David Ralph of Join Up Dots. I'm not sure if you know him, but he's got an amazing daily podcast where he's interviewing entrepreneurs about, how they got to where they are. And we've become friends. He's interviewed me. I've interviewed him. And when he pitched me to be on my show, this was like a year or two ago, he goes, the subject line of his pitch was something to the effect of, there is a lack of sexy middle-aged Englishmen on your podcast. And I was like, I just saw who it was from. And that just made me laugh so much. And I'm like, I don't even know what he wants to teach my listeners, but yes, like you can come on my show because this sounds so fun. So really comedy is really helpful in building relationships, I have to say.
And it's interesting how you take a risk like that. Like that's not the subject line you expect to get like at all. Like subject line, like this email broadcast, that message, that one, then bam, that one. So that's a quite the curveball from what you would typically expect. And when you do submit a pitch, obviously it lands in the podcast host's email. They look at it, but obviously some will say yes, some will say no. But I could like answer this question on my own because I'm a podcast host myself. But I feel like the more you're into it, sometimes you just have more of an instinct where you could say yes or no based on all the things you've seen. It comes more like a habit based on all the experience. So what do you think a podcast host looks for in a potential guest?
So I think what a podcast host looks for in a potential guest is, number one, value for their audience and value for their listeners. So for me as a host, I'm looking for, all right, is this guest going to talk about something that my listeners are going to care about? And if the answer is yes, then I'll go to kind of step 2 criteria. Do I want to talk to them? Because there might be people who have information or valuable stories that my listeners would like. But to do a really good podcast interview, the host and the guest need to have chemistry. There needs to be energy in that conversation that makes it something that is entertaining enough for somebody to actually want to be listening to it. So value for the audience, it's got to be something that the host is just genuinely curious about. I have a show called Women-Splaining. My business partner and I co-host that show together. And it's a show, primarily for women. We're talking about vulnerability and mental illness and trauma. And just like, we're very open about a lot of different, life topics. And we have had, we ask people to pitch us. We're like, if you have a topic that you think is a good fit, let us know. And we always read through them. And sometimes it's a topic where it's a good fit, but it's just like we listen to our gut. We're like, I just don't know if this is the right topic right now. So that's kind of a criteria that's hard to put into words because it really just has to feel right for the host, and the guest too. And then also just being a good speaker. The other thing that I look for in guests is just, are they going to be an entertaining speaker? And when people work with us at Interview Connections, they apply to work with us. I always have a phone call with somebody before they become a client. And there have been times, it's not a lot, because usually when you're ready to hire an agent, you are a good speaker. But there have been times where I get on the phone with someone who wants to be interviewed, and they're just a very dull, monotone speaker. They have an MBA, and it's like, oh my God, this is not going to be good for a podcast. And sometimes I'll say, have you considered a speaking coach? Or, I have a theater background. I did theater my whole childhood and into high school, and did a lot of speaking kind of jobs, going door to door canvassing, where you have to be entertaining and engaging to capture someone's attention. So having that kind of training and background really, really helps if you want to be a good guest. And so, yeah, that's what I would say podcast hosts are looking for is that value, that entertainment, and just the right fit.
And listening to that, that's all the things that I also look for in a guest. So that's definitely something a podcast host is looking for. Now, I asked this question because, if you're a podcast host, it's like, well, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. But if you're someone who wants to get on podcasts, think about that. Think about how you need to have this level of chemistry and be someone who this person will want to interview. So it's very important to think about the host and not just think about the opportunity of being on the podcast. And there are some cases where, for me, I'll contact people and ask them to be on the show. And I feel like that's when you've really made it as someone who's going to be on a lot of podcasts, because people are coming to you, asking you to be on their shows. So how do we reach the point where we've been on a bunch of podcasts and now podcast owners are coming directly to us asking if we could be guests on their shows?
So your question is, how can you reach that point where as a host, you're getting people to want to be on your show?
As a guest, you're getting to the point where hosts are coming to you.
Oh, okay, great. So flip side. So I think that it's just about building credibility and building a brand and doing that consistent marketing that gets your name out there. Honestly, from both sides of the mic, whether you're a host or whether you're a guest, is to be an entrepreneur, to have a personal brand that people know of, right? So it's not just, oh, they're the owner of this business, but who are they? What kind of person are they? The more I grow in my business and the longer I'm in business, the more I'm attracting people, both clients and guests and people to interview me who I just align with personally. And it really helps kind of your mindset around competition, because you realize that everyone has a different personality and a different brand that different people are going to connect. So I think it just takes consistency. It takes time for people to learn who you are. This is sort of like when you start a podcast and you're going for a few months and you're getting tired of the intro music. You're like, I'm going to change the intro music. But as soon as you change it, that's when people started to remember you. So you don't want to change a lot too fast. I'm kind of going off into some different tangents, but my biggest point here is consistency. It's staying out there. It's staying top of mind, and staying on people's radar, staying active on your social media platforms where your target audience is, getting yourself out there, having your own show. I think consistency is the biggest thing, because it's not all about how much money you're making or how well you're doing. It's about being authentic about what your story is and who you are and what your expertise is, staying confident, and people are attracted to that authenticity.
And it's interesting how the theme of consistently comes up again and again. In a lot of interviews, we do strike upon consistency at some point, for be consistent with your work, and then that'll help you in the long run. But how do you suggest we maintain our consistency? Because on some days it's just tempting to kick back and just not do anything, maybe had a rough day. But how are we able to maintain our consistency and continue to serve our audiences?
That is a great question, and I am definitely not perfect at it. So I think a couple of things that can really help is having systems in place that make the show not a grind. So having somebody that helps you with different parts of it, whether that's having an editor or somebody that does show notes or any of the different parts of your podcast that are a drag for you, I think it does help to hire people to help you with that. That being said, you don't have to hire people to do all that stuff. I mean, when Marky and I started Women'splaining, like we're doing the whole thing. We didn't hire anyone to help us with it because, and it's been actually a great learning experience to do the whole podcast, soup to nuts without hiring anyone to help us. It takes a lot longer. I mean, we're putting episodes out every 2 weeks and just have enough time to do that. So I think that to stay consistent, it does help to, number one, just set a schedule and stick to it and just have the integrity to do what you say you were going to do. So if you tell your listeners, I will have an episode out for you every Monday, just stick to your word and figure out how to make it happen because you have time for what you want to do, and if you don't want to put out an episode every Monday and every 2 weeks is good, do that. But I think consistency, there's not like a secret formula or thing that needs to happen. It's just you need to commit to it. And if you find that you're having a really hard time sticking to that schedule, maybe you are having a hard time because you don't enjoy the show as much. And to be honest, that's why I haven't been as consistent with one of my shows because I got so busy in my business and I wasn't super excited about the kind of interviews I was doing that I just kind of fell, off the burner. I just have been behind. So that happens when you podcast for several years. It's not perfect. I mean, people that have been podcasting for 5-10 years and they've never missed a week. Wow, that's incredible. But I think it's just important to, it's important to remember that you are human and that you might miss a couple weeks. My recommendation though, if that is you, if you have a podcast and you're missing some time, you don't worry about it. Just pick up where you left off. Just keep, put out another episode. You don't have to get on the mic and say, hey, sorry, I missed a week. Sorry, I haven't been around. Because the listeners that I've met of my show, Rock the Podcast, they like to binge listen. They're people that are listening to, dozens of podcasts. So they're not really keeping track of what the date is that your last episode came out. They'll go into the backlog. So I think consistency is really important and there are things you can do to keep your shows coming out on a regular basis. But if you fall off the wagon, you miss some weeks, just get back on the horse, rebrand your podcast, change the format so it's something that you're excited to do.
And it's interesting how even if you've been doing it for years, you still have to maintain that excitement. And sometimes that does mean changing the format, whether it's a podcast or a blog or channel or anything else in order to build that excitement and give yourself a stronger reason to maintain your consistency. And when it comes to getting on other podcasts, I feel like a lot of people view that as a means to an end. So getting on more podcasts to drive more traffic to this page or get more clients or something like that. But while we do have this big goal in mind, some of us, we may feel like we're stuck. We may feel like we're just not moving the needle quick enough. So, Jessica, what do you believe holds most people back from reaching their full potential?
Fear. I think it really is fear. We all have fear. And I think that you got to figure out what you're really, really afraid of. What is holding you back? I mean, I've learned that I have a fear of rejection. I didn't realize I did, but I've really come to that realization that, being really afraid of being told no, or for people hearing what you're doing and saying, oh, that's not good enough. I think that's a real fear. I think the reality is, if that resonates with you, and I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that, and maybe it's a fear of something else, acknowledging the fear, realizing that, okay, you're human, you have that fear, that's okay. And just moving forward. I heard that, great successful entrepreneurs, it's not that they don't have fear, it's that they have fear, they acknowledge it, and they act anyway. So I think that you have to figure out what you're afraid of. Most of us know how to move forward. It's but there's blocks that keep us from doing certain things. And so once you acknowledge what those blocks are, and you can do that through, there's personal development strategies and coaches you can talk to and things like that. Once you acknowledge what's holding you back, moving forward and just taking the action. And then honestly, it goes back to consistency. And then the third thing, just to really confuse people, is make sure what you have is amazing and good enough. Because you could have no fear, you're facing all your fears, you're staying consistent, and you're like, but I'm just not growing. Well, look at your show or look at your business or your product or your service, whatever you're doing, and just ask yourself, look at it from an outsider's perspective. You know how they do like secret shoppers in like stores and stuff? Go in as a secret shopper and figure out, all right, if I listen to this show for the first time, would it be good? Would I stay? And just see, how can I make this better?
It's interesting to maintain that, have that secret shopper sense where you listen to your past episodes, which is something that I do to see how I can make each episode better and also to jot down more notes. So there are definitely a lot of things preventing us from reaching our full potential. And you hit on a lot of the key points, especially fear, which is something that comes up again and again when I ask that question. And part of the reason we don't unlock our potential also is because we do face certain challenges. And some people, they feel like they've been knocked down by a lot of challenges. And challenges, they happen to all of us. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if you could share with us one big challenge you faced in your journey and a powerful lesson you learned during that challenge.
I would be happy to share that because I have had some realizations recently. I mean, a challenge that I've really faced is, and I kind of like alluded to this, as I mentioned, I do have a fear of rejection, and that has been a big challenge to me. And it was really just very recently that I've realized that and have actually seen how it was holding me back. And it was kind of a crazy realization, like afraid of rejection. Like, I'm a business owner, like I'm great in sales. I don't understand. But then I realized, like I go after things I know I can get, and the things I'm not sure I can get, I tend to not go after. And it's convenient when the things you're going after and you're getting are really great. But for example, like applying to speak at some conferences, I did not get to speak. I applied to speak at Podcast Movement last year and wasn't selected. And I just took that so personally, which is so silly, right? Like there's so many people that want to speak and you can't expect to always get what you want. But like when you have this fear of rejection, you like take it personally. And so like realizing that and acknowledging that and being like, that's so silly. I can't let that hold me back. I can't not go for something that's really good again. So I was like afraid to apply to speak again because I got turned down last year. And now I'm thinking, okay, I'm acknowledging that fear. I'm realizing that's holding me back because it's really hurting my mindset. I'm acknowledging it, and I'm going to put together a session proposal and go for it again, because what's the worst that could happen? They say no and my ego is bruised. Well, it gets bruised all the time and I'm still here. So I think that, that's a very specific example that I can share, but there's plenty more, I'm sure.
I'm sure of all of us, there are plenty of examples, and that is something really valuable to understand, that it's not good to protect the ego in a point where you're not making these big moves. In Jessica's case, applying to speak at more conferences, because if you keep protecting your ego and keep protecting yourself and try to avoid any type of rejection, you're not going to get all these really incredible opportunities, because you have to get rejected on your way towards success. So that is something that we should all be thinking about when we're considering, should I really be taking this big leap? And the answer in most cases is yes, because that's going to give you a new opportunity. Even if you get rejected, you're still learning more. And speaking of learning, one of the best ways for me that I enjoy learning is to read books. I'll read audiobooks, print books. Like I'll read a lot of different types of books in my industry. But Jessica, I'm wondering if you could share with us 3 book recommendations that you believe these books would have a positive impact on us.
All right. So a couple book recommendations. I will start with a book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And this is a very powerful book. This book, I read it in July or August, and it, I think, was the beginning of a huge transformation in my life. And it really just has you focus on the present moment. And that is an incredibly powerful thing to do. Let's see. Another book recommendation would be The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And oh my gosh, this is such a test. Some of them, I'm drawing a blank on what they are, but like, let's see. Don't take things personally. That's a really good one. Don't make assumptions. That's a good one. Okay, you have to get the book for the other two because I can't remember them, but they're very solid rules to live your life by. And a third one, I'm just thinking of the book that's like on my nightstand right now, which is How to Meditate by Pema Chodron. Oh, and When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. I love her. She's a Buddhist monk and I just love her teaching. So these are not necessarily business books, but I have grown more in my business by focusing on my like personal and spiritual development because it keeps me more present. And I think that has had a really positive impact on my business.
And these aren't business books necessarily, but they do help you with the mind and they give you that self-development. And no matter what, like self-development will help you in any area you're pursuing. So I'm very grateful that you chose to share those 3 books, which, well, actually 4 because you added a bonus, but
yes,
those will be
yeah.
at marketberry.com/E125 for any breakthrough success listeners interested in those links and show notes. And before we wrap up this episode, I'm going to flip the tables a little bit. So Jessica, I've asked you a lot of questions throughout our time together, but what is one question that you believe we need to be asking ourselves more often?
Am I happy? I think that is a question that people need to ask more because we're always living into the future. We're always thinking about what don't I have? I don't have more money. I don't have more listeners. And, we're always thinking about like what we want to do. And I think that it's so important to just say, okay, am I happy in this moment, in this journey, getting towards those amazing goals and intentions that we're setting? Just, are you happy? And you don't have to be happy all the time. You need sadness to understand, to like appreciate happiness. But I think that's super important because life goes by fast.
I definitely agree with the importance of maintaining happiness. And when we're pursuing our goals, it's saddening that we'll focus more on what we have not done than on what we have done. And I actually recently read somewhere that desire, this is a quote, but desire is a contract with yourself to be unhappy until you accomplish what you're setting out to do. So it's great to set goals, but as you're in that journey, to also be happy. And I really think we should be continuing to ask Jessica's question to ourselves over and over again. Am I happy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a big one.
And it's one of those, it's super important because if you do the work, but you're not happy, it doesn't really matter. So I'm very grateful for you for sharing that question. I mean, that's something we should definitely be pondering. And I'm also grateful for all the insights you've shared throughout our time together. And Breakthrough Success listeners, if you want to learn more about Jessica, head over to interviewconnections.com/podcast. She has a lot of awesome content there. So that is interviewconnections.com/podcast. And you could also get her book by the same name, Interview Connections, how to #rock the podcast from both sides of the mic. Jessica, I cannot thank you enough for being a guest on the Breakthrough Success podcast and bringing so many guests my way. It has been such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was a really fun conversation.
How does over 100 retweets per day sound to you? My free ebook, 27 Ways to Get More Retweets on Twitter, has you covered. I use the methods within this ebook to get over 10,000 retweets every single quarter. To learn more and get access to this free resource, visit markberty.com/